Imagine for a second that it's the year 1917.
Yep.
The United States has just entered the horrific, mechanized fray of World War I. And you, being a creative type with an eye for historical drama, decide to make a movie.
Right.
You aren't making a documentary about the current conflict in Europe, though. You're making a sweeping, patriotic epic about the American Revolution. Or, let's say you're a political activist instead.
Sure.
You decide to stand on a soapbox in a public square and hand out a printed pamphlet that criticizes the military draft.
Which sounds totally normal today.
Exactly. I mean, in almost any other era of American history, you're just exercising the basic constitutional rights the country was founded upon. But in 1917, you hear a knock at the door, you're arrested, dragged into federal court, and you find yourself staring down the barrel of decades in a federal penitentiary.
The really jarring part of that scenario is just how quickly the foundation of American civil liberties shifted. A filmmaker could genuinely face 20 years in prison for making a movie about George Washington simply because the British happened to be American allies in 1917.
It's wild.
The logic applied in the courtroom was basically that making the British look bad in 1776 might undermine the public's commitment to fighting alongside them in the trenches of France.
The legal gymnastics required to put someone in prison for a historical film are just staggering. And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
The mission of this deep dive is to explore how a century-old law originally passed to catch traditional spies and stop military insubordination during World War I somehow morphed over the decades.
It really did transform.
Yeah, into the government's primary tool for prosecuting modern whistleblowers, digital journalists, and even former presidents. We've got a comprehensive historical and legal breakdown today, tracing its evolution from its WWI inception right up to the present day.
It's a fascinating timeline.
Right. And why should you care? Because this single piece of legislation dictates the extremely fragile boundary between national security and your right to know what your government is actually doing. Okay, let's unpack this. Take us back to the environment of 1917. What were the specific conditions that allowed a law like this to take root?
Well, the atmosphere in Washington, and honestly across the entire country, was defined by a profound, almost feverish paranoia. The Espionage Act was passed on June 15, 1917.
Right.
That was just after the U.S. formally entered the war. President Woodrow Wilson pushed heavily for it. And he had actually been lobbying Congress for this kind of domestic security apparatus as far back as December 1915, long before the U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Berlin.
So the administration was already looking for a legal hammer before the country even entered the war.
Exactly. Wilson was deeply concerned about divided loyalties among recent immigrants, and he was worried about the growing labor and socialist movements that vehemently opposed American intervention.
Now, I know there was an older law, the Defense Secrets Act of 1911. How did this new 1917 bill differ from what they already had?
The 1911 Act was pretty narrow. It primarily dealt with the physical reality of spying. Obtaining or delivering national defense information, like blueprints of a fortress, to people who weren't entitled to have it.
Traditional cloak and dagger stuff.
Right. But the 1917 Espionage Act was a completely different animal. It added much stiffer penalties, including the death penalty or up to 30 years in prison. But the core of the act criminalized conveying information to interfere with the armed forces, promoting enemy success, causing mutiny, or obstructing military recruitment.
And while stopping mutiny seems pretty straightforward during a massive mobilization, the administration's ambitions went way further. Wilson wasn't just looking for saboteurs, right? He wanted to control the press.
Oh, absolutely. The battle over press censorship is one of the most revealing parts of this whole history. While Congress was debating the bill, Wilson desperately wanted a provision for prior restraint.
Basically press censorship.
Yes. Prior restraint means the government can review and stop a newspaper from publishing a specific story before it's even printed. Wilson personally lobbied for this, arguing it was absolutely necessary to the public safety.
A sitting president demanding the legal right to pre-screen the news? That just seems so antithetical to the First Amendment. How did Congress react?
The pushback was intense. Critics argued it would give dictatorial power to the presidency. After weeks of highly contentious debate, Congress barely stripped the direct censorship provision out of the final bill.
Barely.
They removed it by a single vote in the Senate. The final tally was 39-38.
Wow. A single vote in 1917 is all that separated the American press from legalized executive censorship. If one senator flips, the whole trajectory of American journalism changes. But even without prior restraint, Congress still gave the Wilson administration a massive loophole, didn't they?
They did. They gave it to the Postmaster General, a man named Albert S. Burleson. Since the administration couldn't directly tell newspapers what not to print, Congress gave Burleson the authority to impound or refuse to mail anything he deemed a violation of the act.
Which, in 1917, is everything. There's no internet, no TV, no commercial radio. If you want to distribute anything, you need the mail.
Exactly. It was a backdoor censorship apparatus. Burleson was a staunch partisan loyalist, and he set up a nationwide network of postmasters to watch the mail.
Do we have specific examples of what they banned?
Oh, plenty. They targeted populist and socialist publications. For instance, they banned the Jeffersonian, which was a populist paper published by Tom Watson. He was a vocal critic of the draft. When he sued, a federal judge sided with the Postmaster General, calling the publication poison.
I read that the censors even flagged a headline in the paper that read, "Civil Liberty Dead," as grounds for suppression.
Which is incredibly ironic.
Right. They suppressed the paper for saying civil liberties were dead, thereby proving civil liberties were dead. It's a perfect closed loop.
And they went after the masses, too, right?
Yes. The Masses was a socialist monthly in New York. The government didn't even point to a specific military secret they leaked. They revoked its Manning privileges based on its general tenor.
Just the vibe of the magazine.
Pretty much. Judge Leonard Hand initially ruled in favor of the magazine, saying you can't suppress speech just because it might indirectly discourage someone from enlisting. But the government appealed, stayed the injunction, and then starved the publication out of existence by keeping it out of the mail while the legal battles dragged on.
Burleson didn't even need a conviction. He just needed administrative power. Now, before we move on to 1918, there's a really strange quirk of history buried in the original 1917 text regarding naval vessels. What was that about?
Yeah, this is fascinating. The act originally forbade transferring naval vessels to nations in a conflict where the U.S. is neutral. In 1917, that makes sense. They didn't want private shipbuilders dragging the U.S. into war. Makes total sense.
But fast forward to the early years of World War II. FDR is in the Oval Office, Europe is falling to the Nazis, and Great Britain desperately needs naval destroyers. The U.S. is legally neutral.
Oh, I see where this is going.
FDR wants to execute a destroyer's four bases agreement to aid Great Britain. But he suddenly finds himself completely stonewalled by this obscure clause in the Espionage Act of 1917.
A law designed by the Wilson administration ends up binding FDR's hands decades later. That's incredible. But if 1917 laid the groundwork, 1918 is when things really escalated, right? The Red Scare era.
Oh, it escalated massively. Congress decided the original act didn't go far enough, so they passed the Sedition Act of 1918. The 1917 law was technically focused on actions, like interfering with military operations. The 1918 Sedition Act explicitly criminalized speech.
What kind of speech?
It prohibited any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government, the flag, or the military uniform.
Scurrilous. Who decides what's scurrilous? That's entirely subjective.
That was the point. It gave prosecutors a huge net, and the convictions from this era are just absurd. Take Eugene V. Debs, for example.
The Socialist Party candidate for president?
Yes. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech in Canton, Ohio, that supposedly obstructed recruiting. He wasn't telling men to burn draft cards. He was just giving a broad critique of the war.
And he famously ran for president from his prison cell in 1920, right?
He did. He got nearly 1 million votes from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary.
It's just wild to think about. And the enforcement wasn't even consistent. What happened with Kate Richards O'Hare?
She was another prominent anti-war socialist. She traveled the country giving the exact same stump speech in multiple states. But she was only convicted and sentenced to 5 years in North Dakota.
Why just North Dakota?
Because enforcement was entirely up to local U.S. attorneys. If a prosecutor in one district was zealous or offended by her rhetoric, they'd charge her. If another didn't care, she went free. It was geographical roulette.
Which brings us back to our filmmaker from the intro, Robert Goldstein.
Right. Goldstein produced The Spirit of 76, a movie about the American Revolution. He was prosecuted and sentenced to 10 years under the Espionage Act.
Because the movie showed British cruelty.
Exactly. The government argued that depicting British cruelty, even during the Revolution, might undermine support for America's current WWI ally.
Jailed for historical accuracy because of current foreign policy.
It wasn't just politics and entertainment either. It hit religious groups. Joseph Rutherford, the president of the Watchtower Society, which we know today as Jehovah's Witnesses, was sentenced to 20 years.
20 years for what?
The society published a book claiming that patriotism was a narrowly minded hatred. The government argued that defining patriotism that way was an attempt to cause insubordination in the military.
So we have a presidential candidate, a traveling socialist, a filmmaker, and a religious leader all thrown in prison. Where was the Supreme Court in all this? What about the First Amendment?
Well, this brings us to a huge landmark case in 1919, Schenck v. United States. Charles Schenck mailed anti-draft pamphlets to drafted men, arguing the draft was involuntary servitude under the 13th Amendment. He was convicted, and he appealed to the Supreme Court.
And the court upheld it.
They did, unanimously. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion, and he created the clear and present danger test.
That's where the famous theater analogy comes from, right?
Yes. Holmes famously originated the concept that the First Amendment doesn't protect falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater and causing a panic. He argued that during wartime, Schenck's pamphlets were like shouting fire.
People still use that analogy today to justify banning speech. But what's fascinating here is that Justice Holmes actually changed his mind almost immediately after that, didn't he?
It is fascinating. After meeting with free speech advocates, including Harvard Law professor Zechariah Chafee, Holmes began doubting his own decision. Later that same year, in Abrams v. United States, the court upheld the convictions of Russian immigrants who distributed leaflets denouncing U.S. intervention in the Russian Revolution.
But Holmes didn't vote with the majority this time.
No, he wrote a blistering dissent. He argued that the surreptitious publishing of a silly leaflet by an unknown man doesn't present an immediate danger. He completely pivoted away from his own shouting fire analogy to defend free expression.
That's a massive shift. So how did this era end?
The Red Scare eventually faded, and the Sedition Act was repealed in 1921. The Espionage Act kind of fell into relative disuse after that.
Until World War II and the Cold War, right? Because they didn't repeal the core 1917 Act. They just left it on the books.
Exactly. But surprisingly, prosecutions actually dropped during WWII.
Why is that? You'd think with a global war against the Axis powers, they'd use it constantly.
Mostly because there was far less organized public opposition after Pearl Harbor compared to WWI. But WWII does give us one of the most incredible press leak stories. The Midway leak.
Yes. The Chicago Tribune story? Walk us through that.
So just after the U.S. won the Battle of Midway in 1942, Stanley Johnson of the Chicago Tribune essentially leaked that the U.S. had broken Japanese codes. He published a front-page story with such accurate details about the Japanese fleet that it was obvious the codes were broken.
And the Japanese saw it.
They did, and they changed their codes as a result, which was a massive blow to U.S. intelligence. The government was furious and convened a grand jury to indict the publishers.
If they didn't go through with it, they dropped the case.
Because prosecuting them would require the U.S. Navy to stand up in open court and definitively verify the highly classified information to a jury. It would compound the damage. Attorney General Francis Biddle later said the whole thing made him feel like a fool.
So they hit a wall prosecuting the press. But as the Cold War starts, the focus shifts away from pamphlets and newspapers and moves toward actual traditional spies, right?
Right. The nuclear age changes everything. The focus shifts to Soviet espionage. The most famous example is the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953 for giving nuclear secrets to the Soviets.
But Congress was also tweaking the law behind the scenes during this time.
Yes, and this is a crucial legal shift. In 1950, Congress overrode President Truman's veto to pass the McCarran Internal Security Act. It added Section 793E to the Espionage Act.
What did that section do?
It removed the intent requirement. Before, prosecutors had to prove you intended to harm the U.S. or aid an enemy. The new section meant that the mere retention of classified information became a crime.
Mere retention, meaning regardless of whether you meant to do harm, just having the documents and not giving them back was a felony.
Exactly. It's a terrifying implication that set a massive trap for future government employees. Which brings us to the 1970s and 80s.
The era of the Pentagon Papers and the year of the spy. Let's talk about the Pentagon Papers first.
Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo were charged for publishing a massive classified history of the Vietnam War. They leaked it to the press.
The Nixon administration tried to stop the New York Times from printing it, which is prior restraint again.
Right. But the Supreme Court ruled against prior restraint of the press. However, they explicitly stated the government could still potentially prosecute the publishers under the Espionage Act after the fact.
The Supreme Court basically said, you can print it, but we won't protect you from going to jail afterward. Ellsberg himself was charged.
He was, but he was freed due to a mistrial because of gross prosecutorial misconduct by the government, including the Nixon administration burglarizing his psychiatrist's office.
Wow. But the government really wanted to establish a precedent for punishing leaks to the press. And they finally got it in 1984 with Samuel Loring Morrison. I find this case fascinating.
Morrison is the crucial precedent. He wasn't a Soviet spy. He was a government analyst who sent classified satellite photos of a Soviet nuclear carrier to Jane's, a British defense publisher.
And what was his defense?
He argued the American public needed to know what the Soviets were doing so they would support increases in defense budgets.
A patriotic defense. How did the prosecution counter that?
They pointed out he was being paid by Jane's, so they argued he wanted money and was just disgruntled. But legally, his motive didn't matter. What's crucial here is that Morrison became the very first American government official convicted for giving classified information to the press.
The very first, after nearly 70 years of this law existing.
Right. It became a permanent test case for the government. They proved they could use it as a weapon to threaten the media. CIA Director William Casey explicitly used that precedent in 1986 to threaten newspapers if they published intercepted communications.
So the Morrison case arms the government for what's coming next. We're moving into the 21st century pivot. And just a quick note for the listener as we get into these modern cases. We are not taking a political side or endorsing either the leakers or the administration's actions here. We are merely reporting the facts from the source material regarding these highly charged political events.
Right, maintaining strict neutrality on the politics here.
So tell us about this massive shift in the 2000s and 2010s.
The Obama and Trump administrations aggressively used the act, not against traditional spies, but against leakers and whistleblowers communicating with the press. It started building up in the late 90s with Wen-Ho Lee.
The Los Alamos scientist.
Yes. He made backup copies of nuclear codes. The government spun this massive espionage narrative, but it totally collapsed. He pled guilty to one count of mishandling info, and the judge actually apologized to him in court for believing the government's initial overblown claims.
And then in 2010, you have Thomas Andrews Drake.
Drake was indicted for willful retention. He was trying to blow the whistle on the NSA's Trailblazer project, an expensive domestic surveillance program, to a Baltimore Sun reporter.
And then the scale of the leaks just explodes with Chelsea Manning.
Manning was convicted on 6 counts of violating the act for the massive WikiLeaks disclosure of diplomatic cables and military logs. She was sentenced to 35 years in a military prison.
35 years, though President Obama later commuted it to 7 years.
Right. And then in 2013, Edward Snowden was charged under the act after exposing the NSA's PRISM mass surveillance program. And later, Reality Winner was sentenced to over 5 years.
Which was the longest sentence ever at the time for media leaks, right? For transmitting a document about Russian election interference.
Exactly. And this roll call of leakers highlights the core tension of this modern era.
What is that tension? What are the two sides arguing?
Well, President Obama argued that these leaks put military personnel at direct risk, compromise ongoing missions, and reveal intelligence methods. Basically, the system relies on absolute control of classified information to protect the country.
But the defense attorneys see it completely differently.
Completely. The defense argues their clients are whistleblowers, making crucial public interest disclosures. They say exposing illegal government actions or overreach to the press is protected by the First Amendment.
But the Espionage Act doesn't recognize a difference between a spy selling secrets for cash and a whistleblower going to the New York Times.
No, it doesn't. The physical act of transmission is the crime.
Which brings us to the modern era where things get even more complex. And again, to the listener, we are maintaining strict political neutrality regarding the figures we're about to discuss. We are presenting the charges purely as factual applications of the Espionage Act based on our sources.
Understood. Let's look at Julian Assange.
Charged in 2019 under the Act.
Yes, for seeking classified info, specifically the 2010 Manning leaks, which included the collateral murder video showing a U.S. helicopter attack. Assange is an Australian citizen. He spent 5 years in a UK maximum security prison fighting extradition before pleading guilty to one count in 2024 to secure his release.
Why is this case viewed as such a massive precedent?
Because it sets a terrifying global precedent. The U.S. used a domestic espionage statute to reach into foreign territories and charge a non-U.S. journalist operating as a publisher. It vastly expands the law's reach.
And then you have bizarre cases that test the law in completely different ways, like Jack Teixeira.
The Teixeira case is a modern, surreal twist. He was an Air National Guardsman who didn't leak to newspapers or foreign spies. He leaked highly classified documents onto a Discord server called Thug Shaker Central.
To impress gamers.
Yes. Many of these kids didn't even understand the documents. He just wanted social clout online. But under the Espionage Act, unauthorized transmission is unauthorized transmission. The venue doesn't matter.
It's absurd. The full weight of a WWI spy law crashing down on a kid showing off on a gaming chat server. But the ultimate stress test of the act, of course, involved Donald Trump.
Yes, the ultimate stress test. Former President Trump was indicted on 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information, which goes right back to that 1950 McCarran Act amendment we discussed.
This was after the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago in 2022 regarding nuclear documents and military plans.
Right. The charges were purely about the willful retention of those documents after his presidency. But the case was dismissed in 2024 by Judge Aileen Cannon on constitutional grounds regarding the special counsel's appointment. And the DOJ dropped its appeal after Trump's 2024 election win.
So what does this all mean for the listener? We've seen this law hit socialists, filmmakers, naval analysts, NSA whistleblowers, publishers, gamers, and a former president. What's the fundamental flaw here?
The overwhelming criticism from legal experts, civil rights attorneys, and groups like the PEN American Center all point to the fair trial dilemma. Imagine you are charged under this act today for blowing the whistle on something illegal.
Okay, I'm at the defense table.
This raises an important question. How do you defend yourself?
How do I?
You almost can't. The act is over 100 years old. It was written 35 years before the word classification even existed in government vocabulary.
So the law wasn't even built for the modern classification system.
Exactly. And according to lawyers who defend these cases, the courtroom rules gag the defense. You are completely barred from using the word whistleblower in front of the jury.
Seriously?
Yes. You cannot mention the First Amendment. You cannot bring up the rampant problem of government overclassification where millions of harmless documents are stamped secret just to avoid hassle.
So I can't explain why I leaked it.
No. There is strictly no public interest defense. The jury is never allowed to hear why you leaked the document or if it saved lives or exposed a crime. They only decide if you had the document and if you transmitted it.
That makes a conviction almost a mathematical certainty.
And on top of that, it costs up to $3 million to mount a defense. You are financially ruined just trying to fight it.
It's a completely stacked deck. Well, let's recap this astonishing journey we've been on today. A 1917 law passed to stop WWI sabotage and punish movie producers somehow became the mechanism that executed Soviet spies, prosecuted Pentagon officials, jailed modern digital whistleblowers, and ultimately ensnared a former president.
It's incredibly durable and infinitely malleable.
And we rely on the press to know what our government does in the dark. But the government relies on the Espionage Act to keep the lights off.
That tension isn't going away.
No, it's not. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We live in a digital age where every citizen with a smartphone is a potential publisher, and the government automatically generates millions of secret documents a day by default. So, does a blunt instrument law meant for trench warfare actually protect our democracy, or does it slowly suffocate the very transparency a democracy requires to survive?
It's a heavy question.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.